Welcome back to the Autosport YouTube channel, where we bring you some breaking Formula 1 news. And that news is that the grid will be expanding to 22 cars from 2026. The American car giant General Motors are bringing their brand Cadillac to the grid, as an agreement in principle has been made between Formula 1 and the FIA for them to join the grid in just over a year's time. Well, here's a statement from departing Liberty Media CEO and President Greg Maffei. He says that with Formula 1's continued growth plans in the US, we've always believed that welcoming an impressive US brand like Cadillac and General Motors to the grid, and General Motors as a future power supplier, could bring additional value and interest to the sport. We credit the leadership of General Motors and their partners with significant progress in their readiness to enter Formula 1. We are excited to move forward with the application process for the GM Cadillac team to enter the championship in 2026. Well, to break down what this means for General Motors, for Formula 1, and for the rest of it, I'm delighted to have Jake Boxall-Legge with me, aka JBL. First of all, how are you? It's been a lively evening.
Certainly, but it's very exciting news, Bryn, isn't it? As someone that grew up in the 90s watching Formula 1 and the early 2000s as well, you know, I was used to having 11 cars on the grid. So to be back to that, it's really speaking to me, and delighted to get into it because, as I say, it's huge news.
It's always been a bit strange. Why can't we go to 22 cars for 11 teams? And we have an answer. We're going to be having it from 2022. But what was it that got the deal finally over the line over the Vegas weekend? Do you know?
So it's been as we know, it's been in discussion for a couple of years now, as we'll get into it. And obviously Formula 1 had denied that Andretti entry. But I think it was very, very keen to have General Motors involved in some capacity. Of course, having another car brand involved, something that it was chasing with this 2026 regulations. The fact that it has now lost Renault as a manufacturer, I think has an impact, in my mind at least. But obviously we got to the point now where there were discussions were accelerating, and then it seemed to be, they had all of their head honchos at Las Vegas. So that's the CEO Dan Torres, who was taking control from Michael Andretti of the enterprise with the team itself, and it just came to that conclusion that suddenly that there was this space on the grid, and we'll look into the nuts and bolts, I'm sure, over the course of this. But yeah, ultimately the very, very good news that F1 is getting this 11th team. Obviously the team has been working towards this in the background, even despite not getting that entry, that factory at Silverstone, bringing on some very, very big names involved. So clearly Formula 1 considered having this team, having another car brand involved, was just too good an opportunity to pass on.
Yeah, given what appears to be, it seems to be from the outside looking, a rapid change of mind from FOM, who are the commercial rights holders. What was it with this deal in mind that allowed this to happen and so quickly?
Again, I think this has its roots in Michael Andretti leaving the team. Leaving control elsewhere to Dan Torres, who a little bit of background on who he is, because I don't think that he's somebody that's particularly well known. He's the CEO of the Group 1001 group of companies. So for any followers of IndyCar, you'll have seen the Gainbridge branding on Colton Herta's car and around some of the circuits. That's part of that. So it's a very, very big institution of financial companies, insurance companies, that kind of thing. So obviously the money is there. I think having this greater alignment with General Motors as well, clearly when the application process was happening and Cadillac saying that it would produce an engine, or General Motors saying that it would produce an engine under the Cadillac brand, that curried some favour with F1. It certainly did with the FIA. And I think they figured we want to keep them involved in some capacity. But how everybody is spoken for with regards to powertrains, they can't come in until 2028. But I think the growth of that team, the partners involved on board, obviously General Motors and Group 1001, the money is there, as I say. It just made it a little bit kind of irresistible, let's say. So these are changes that had continued even after the rejection of the entry. And I think ultimately the numbers made sense when it perhaps didn't before. And again, and if I'm going to be a little bit cynical about this, looking at Andretti as a name, and we'll go into this again, it's huge in terms of motorsport, in terms of drivers, the legacy that Mario Andretti left, the legacy that Michael Andretti left. But in terms of as a team now, it has a lot of fingers and a lot of pies. It's involved in sports car racing. It's involved in, obviously, the flagship is IndyCar, Formula E. It won a title with Jake Dennis a couple of years ago. But that flagship IndyCar team, it's not what you would call a tier one team. It's not Team Penske. It's not Chip Ganassi Racing. It always seems to thrive in almost, but not quite land, if that makes sense. And so I think if you're looking at it dispassionately, taking the Mario and Michael legacy out of it, you look at this team and you think, is this really a top level team that Formula One wants to be courting? And I suspect the answer is probably no. And potentially the way Michael Andretti went about things as well rubbed F1 up the wrong way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's an American brand, an American team that are coming in to make that 11th team on the grid. It shows how the sport is expanding into North America anyway. But with Cadillac at the helm, they've said their engine will not be ready, or their power unit will not be ready until 2028. So who is it that's going to be providing their power unit for 2026 and 2027?
Well, it could essentially be anybody with the capacity to do so. And I think the two biggest names there are Ferrari or Honda. Now, obviously, when the entry was happening before, when it was just Andretti, there was that pre-contract with Renault to provide the powertrains. It can no longer do that because Renault is not entering its own powertrain into 2026. So Ferrari has a slot available because that will be vacated by Sauber, who's moving to obviously becoming Audi. And Honda only has one team, which is Aston Martin. So there's the options there. As we say, it is only a make weight for 2 years because they'll have their own engine online. But yeah, obviously something competitive would be nice. But again, it's a short-term solution. They do have their own long-term solution in place. They just need the extra couple of years because all of these other brands have had a few years to get their head around the new regulations, have been hard at work developing batteries and hardware, internal combustion engines, everything like that for the last couple of years. Cadillac hasn't had that. So ultimately giving it the 2 years grace period to go away and work on something, just make sure that the entry is right when we get to that point.
Does that dictate that maybe, or maybe state that it's been a bit of a rapid turnaround for Cadillac, for General Motors as well? They weren't quite expecting this to happen so soon if they haven't got anything in place, or was it they weren't going to start looking at a power unit until the actual contract was signed?
It was always the case that it was going to be 2028. I think even under the initial entry with Andretti. I don't think the plan was initially for General Motors to do it back at the nascency of that entry. When Andretti wanted to come in, as I say, they had that pre-contract with Renault. I don't think that the FIA was sufficiently impressed if it was just going to be a customer entity. They've already got plenty of those. It needed to bring something new. General Motors has never been involved in Formula One in a full capacity before. So having them on board, having Cadillac on board, that's a huge boon. But as I say, it was always the plan to do it in 2028 if they were going to come in as an engine supplier. So ultimately, they're going to have to wait. But, good things come to those who wait. So hopefully it's a competitive prospect.
Absolutely. You mentioned Andretti a few times here, but now he's no longer officially a partner then. What's his involvement going to be with the setup with the team going forward? What's his role?
Well, he's been conspicuously left out of every single media release that has gone out. So I'm going to suggest that he's not going to have any real discernible role in this. But, let's talk about the people who are, as we've already spoken about Dan Torres, the CEO of Group 1001, the majority shareholder in the team. But they've brought in a lot of good people as well. So over the last few months, and I think this is probably the headline one as well, that Pat Simmons is coming into the team as a consultant, as an advisor, and he's joining directly from Formula One. So when you consider that move, he must have known that there was still an avenue to go down with this team, that he understood, okay, sure, they've not been granted an entry, but clearly there is some leeway for this team to become something that F1 wants to consider. And there's a lot of ex Renault personnel there. So Rob White has joined the team. You've got Nick Chester as technical director. It's sort of like a little bit of a Renault old boys club in many ways. So there's a lot of familiar names there. There's a lot of people with Formula One experience. I think one of the things teams are worried about is safeguarding themselves against brain drain, against teams being, snapped up for a fair bit of money to get this project online. And of course, they do have the factory working. They've got a wind tunnel model already working, I believe, in Cologne. So this is something that's continuing to go on. So these are the people that are actively working on it. I don't know if Michael Andretti will have a role. I don't know if he'll be a representative or anything like that. But I think given the fact that the team has lost his name, suggests that he's going to play no further involvement in it.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big name. It's such a big family, the Andretti family. Can you give us a bit of maybe a breakdown, the history of the Andretti family? Their racing credentials, then trying to get into Formula One with buying the team, or buying a team, should we say, then with them linking up with Cadillac, and now Cadillac getting onto the grid. What can you tell us there?
It's a little bit like, who do you think you are, this, isn't it? So obviously, Mario Andretti, I don't think he needs much of an introduction, but a huge powerhouse in US racing. And he was racing at the top level for about 30 years across IndyCar, or its forebear, USAC, the USAC Championship Series. Won that in 1965, 1966, and 1969. And then he went to Formula One, won the 1978 world title with Lotus. Results kind of declined a little bit, left Formula One in 1980, after the end of 1982, after a few cameo runs with Williams and Ferrari and that kind of thing. Then he went back to IndyCar and won again the title in 1984, and continued to race for another 10 years after that, by which time he was even older than Fernando Alonso is when he finished. So huge career Mario Andretti had, and still getting behind the wheel of anything that he can today. The passion never really leaves you. His son Michael, of course, was the progenitor of this team. Won the IndyCar Championship in 1981. Then he had that ill-fated switch to Formula One in 93 with McLaren. Huge amounts of, because it was at a time when IndyCar and Formula One were considered very, very similar, considered rival series. Nigel Mansell went over there and caused a lot of publicity. Michael went the other way and joined McLaren, and it just didn't work out. And it was because he wasn't prepared to make the sacrifices that perhaps he needed to be successful in Formula One. Didn't want to move near the McLaren factory, didn't want to move from the US, but clearly still wanted to be involved in Formula One after that. Did go back to IndyCar, bought Team Green a stake in the Team Green team in 2003, and that's what has become Andretti Autosport since. So again, these are the sort of building blocks in place for that. And then ultimately there was the attempt at a Sauber buyout in 2021. Now, if you look at Sauber, obviously rescued in 2017 by a group called Longbow Finance, which was backed by Finn Rausing, a Swedish businessman involved in Tetra Pak. So made a lot of money off that. But he didn't like the Andretti offer. And Andretti offered a lot of money, but he didn't want to cede control. He wanted to keep a stake in the team, and he wanted to keep a say in the team. And Andretti didn't want to sanction that. So unfortunately, that bid never came through, and then that led to Audi happening. So Andretti still wanted to be involved in Formula One. So it did try to buy a team. It didn't work. And so it attempted to come into Formula One. When was it? Last year, 2023, the tender process was opened. If you look at that tender process as well, the FIA opened it up kind of against the wishes of Formula One. You had Andretti, you had Hitech, you had Rodin, and you had the Lucky Sons teams all trying to enter. Andretti got put forward by the FIA, had to work with FOM on the commercial side, but clearly it wasn't deemed satisfactory on that front. You had a lot of team principal, let's say, pushback for their entry. I think there were legitimate concerns, and these are the concerns that will crop up now, which is, how is the prize money going to be divided? Are they going to be poaching staff from other teams? Are they going to be in the mix for staff? Are they going to be stealing Americans? Not stealing as such, but taking American sponsors? These are all of the things that they've got to consider. But then there was sort of slightly more nebulous complaints as well. So clearly those ones haven't rung through, and clearly they don't apply when it comes to Cadillac and GM over Andretti. So I think that's the potted history of the team there.
And just how big a deal is it for Formula One then, getting this 11th team onto the grid finally for the growth of the sport, and it being an American team as well? How important is it to get that for us, the fans, to have 11 teams, 22 cars, but for the sport itself?
Well, I think I'll come at this from a sort of fan's point of view, because obviously I am a fan of Formula One, and I think it is great. You want as many cars on the grid as possible. I'd love to see the full suite of 13 teams. Unfortunately, I don't think that's ever going to happen in my lifetime, but having an extra team to get behind, having that American fan base on tap as well, one that's familiar with the Cadillac brand, that's going to move mountains for Formula One, certainly to get a foothold. There's lots of other ancillary things as well. There's Ford versus GM. That's something NASCAR has had. That's something IndyCar has had to a certain degree back in the day. It's something that, Australian supercars has had as well. We've never had that in Formula One before. So I think that's a huge little undercurrent. Obviously Ford, working with Red Bull on their powertrain project. I think that's quite an interesting little undercurrent. But I think there's a symbolic aspect of this as well. And if you go back to Formula One post-financial crash, for most of the time, other than perhaps a few seasons when they had that introduction of the new teams, it's been largely 10 teams on the grid. And the ones that did come in, they weren't very well financed, and they died after a few years. We haven't had 11 teams since 2016. So this will be 10 years that we've had 20 cars. Yeah, full 10 years that we've had 20 cars on the grid. Formula One wanted to be in a place where it could start accepting more teams again, where it felt that it could provide that sort of equitable championship for an extra team. And I would argue that, we maybe had that a couple of years ago, but it is now in a place where it feels that it can have an 11th team sustainably. It feels that it's making enough of us, Formula One's boomed, obviously. It's making enough of a splash, both culturally, financially, that kind of thing, to support that. As I say, there's there were concerns from perhaps other teams. One of the more nebulous suggestions was, I think, courtesy of Christian Horner, who said something along the lines of, where are we going to put them at circuits like Zandvoort and things like that? And it's like, well, like they're not housing another Formula One team for filming purposes. So yeah, I think for Formula One to be in that place where it is much more equitable now for an 11th team to come in, it is getting over that 10 years of difficulty post-financial crash, during the sort of very start of the turbo hybrid era, the period where we were losing teams seemingly every couple of years, the mass manufacturer pullouts. Formula One is now getting to a place now where it can have that, and it seems to be much more sustainable for these teams to do it. Now, obviously, there's a big discussion of finance in that there's going to be a very, very big dilution fee to pay for 2025, and before it was set at $200 million. We don't know what the exact sum is now because it's not been officially revealed with the 2026 Concord Agreement, but it's probably north of $600 million, which is a lot of money. But clearly they have the money to pay for that. So for them to be sustainable, for Formula One to sustainably keep an 11th team, I think it just shows how far the championship has come in perhaps the last 5 years. So I think it's really, really good news, and it's good news for retaining interest in America as well, long term, not just beyond, not just having the sort of like Netflix boom and bust and that kind of thing. There's more to it than that. It's much more nuanced, and I think having Cadillac on board, having General Motors on board, is massive for American interest. What
we haven't even discussed yet is who might drive the cars in 2026 and beyond. So it's very early days, but opening up to a 21 and 22nd driver on the grid, who might fill those roles?
Well, I think with the driver market being so dynamic this year, there's a lot of drivers that are left over. Now, I think the ideal way that you would want to do it with a new team is you'd want to have at least one experienced driver. That's always worked very, very well. And there's one name that springs to mind, which is probably Valtteri Bottas. You've got a race-winning driver there that doesn't have a seat for next year, probably primed for a Mercedes reserve role for 2025, but he wants to drive and race in Formula One. He doesn't just want to be a reserve driver and look over Toto Wolff's shoulder in the garage. He wants to be racing. So I think he would be a logical acquisition for them. If it was up to me, partner them with youth. Are they going to go for an American? That is the question. There's not, let's say, a huge number of American stars coming through the European ranks. There's Ugo Chukwu, who obviously won Macau and is very, very highly rated. But I think he'd probably be a little bit young at that point. Theoretically, with an engine deal, they could take somebody on loan. So if it's a Ferrari young driver, something like that, or somebody that Honda supports, that would be a good way of knocking a few million off of an engine bill. Also, it depends on who's coming up through the ranks in F2 next year, who's performing elsewhere. Do I think that they'd get somebody from IndyCar? I think that would be a long shot. Obviously, it'd be nice to sort of have someone like Colton Herta or somebody of that caliber, but I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think that sort of dream lived and died with Andretti. I think Cadillac will be relatively sensible. If there is an American that makes sense for them, they'll probably take them. But I don't think there is at the moment. I think you would have to have Bottas, and you'd have to have either somebody that's left, I guess, available at the end of the next driver contract cycle, or somebody young, or take somebody that's going to, make the engines a little bit cheaper. I think there's a lot of options out there. And I think it's very, very exciting, because obviously we like to have a grid full of very, very talented drivers, and that would fit the bill.
Going to be fascinating to watch how this one plays out. JBL, thank you very much indeed. And there you go. There's our quick look at this breaking news story. The new team 2026 General Motors and Cadillac in Formula One, making up the 11th team. So there'll be 22 drivers for 2026. But who will those drivers be? Let us know in the comments. And how competitive a team do you think they'll be as well? As I say, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and keep up to date with all of this developing story at autosport.com. But as always, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.